Phil, I was up in Green Bay on Sunday at Lambeau Field. Got to see a fun game, 22-zip against the Buffalo Bills.
I was actually in Milwaukee that exact same time watching the Brewers clinch the Central Division.
Good job. And what, the previous Friday, we were both at the Brewer game.
Yeah, I was wearing my Tigers jersey. You were wearing a Brewers hat, I believe.
Yes. Good week for Wisconsin sports, but as I was sitting at Lambeau Field for the big game, I couldn't help but think that Foxconn, the flat screen manufacturer that's coming to Racine County, thanks to our taxpayer dollars, that the plant down in Racine is going to be the size of 11 Lambeau Fields.
And Lambeau Field ain't small.
No, it's huge. And according to the governor, it's going to provide up to 13,000 jobs. It's going to be a $10 billion plant on 20 million square feet. It's going to produce 10,000 construction jobs plus 6,000 indirect jobs from the construction, according to the governor. And the average salary, once all these people are hired, is going to be $50-some thousand. That's why the governor last spring said, quote, this is going to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Wisconsin.
Or maybe twice in a generation?
Or maybe 3 or 4 or 5. Where does it stop if we keep handing out these subsidies?
They're voting on a new subsidy this fall, aren't they?
State lawmakers just announced that they are going to have an extraordinary session right after the election to vote on a $100 million
Foxconn-style incentive package is what they're calling it.
For the Kimberly-Clark paper plant. So very quickly here, this once-in-a-generation opportunity has become two. And where does it stop?
Well, maybe Scott Walker was technically right. Maybe it was once in a generation. We're just in a new generation right now for Kimberly-Clark. So now the new generation is starting.
Yeah, maybe a baby was just born.
And every week we'll have a new generation, and that will give us an opportunity to basically dole out corporate welfare to new companies whenever we feel like it.
Well, we're going to talk about this Kimberly-Clark subsidy bill.
And the extraordinary session that it'll be voted in.
During a lame duck session of the legislature on this week's Center Stage podcast. This is the Wisconsin State Journal's political podcast from the sensible center of Wisconsin politics. I'm Scott Milfred, the editorial page editor for the Wisconsin State Journal.
I'm Phil Hands. I'm the political cartoonist for the Wisconsin State Journal.
And we are half of the Wisconsin State Journal editorial board.
The better looking half. What's that sound, Scott?
I'm not sure. It sounds like an animal.
Is that quacking I hear? Maybe it's a mallard or some other type of wood duck or something?
Madison mallards? They're not in season right now.
Must be just a common duck. But wait a minute, do I hear like it's limp or lame?
Yeah, it sounds like it's in pain, and sounds like there's more than one of them.
Are we hearing lame ducks?
I think we are. It sounds like Scott Fitzgerald, Senate Majority Leader of Wisconsin, and the rest of the state Senate in a lame duck session right after the election.
Well, if the duck is lame, at least if it has Aflac insurance, it can still get paid when it misses work, right?
Yeah.
Aflac!
Do they still do those ads?
I think they do. If you watch football, which is the only time I ever watched live television, it's when you see an Aflac ad every now and again.
Well, the legislative leaders just announced this week that they're going to schedule a extraordinary session
to pass an extraordinary measure, right?
The second extraordinary measure of elaborate tax credits for another manufacturer. This is a little bit different of a manufacturer. When they did it for the Foxconn plant in Racine County, this was going to be a brand new spanking plant with technology.
A once-in-a-generation opportunity to get Wisconsin involved in the technology sector.
And it was going to cost taxpayers an estimated $4.5 billion.
With a B.
Over the next 15-ish years. And that did pass the legislature, and we thought that was it. But now, because Kimberly-Clark, a paper company, they make adult diapers and
paper towels,
all sorts of things like that up in the Fox Valley, they announced they were going to close a couple plants, and some of the lawmakers and the people in the Fox Valley were saying, hey, what about ours?
Yeah, where's our Foxconn-style deal?
How come we're going to subsidize the payroll of a foreign corporation? We're going to subsidize their payroll 17% in Foxconn, but we're going to let our own company that's been here for
100 years or so,
something like that, 100 years or more, we won't do anything to save them. So where's their government check?
It's coming.
And it may be coming. It's still not clear if they have the votes.
So this Kimberly-Clark bailout package, it's basically a bailout. They're gonna give them an additional tax incentive to pay their workers if they keep jobs. This bailout package already passed the Assembly, and so they're hoping that, and it didn't pass the Senate because a couple of Republican senators held out.
Chris Kapenga and also Senator Nass.
Yeah,
but it's very similar to the Foxconn deal in terms of how much it would cost per job. The Legislative Fiscal Bureau had analyzed the Foxconn subsidies, and just in terms of state incentives, it was going to be $200-some thousand per job. Well, the Kimberly-Clark plant that they hope to stay open with government help, it's a $100 million package to save 500 jobs, so you get about $200,000 per job.
That seems like a lot of money to spend on 500 jobs, doesn't it?
It sure is, and at some point you can't keep doing that over and over and over again. I thought Senator Kapenga explained it well on Upfront with Mike Goucher, the Sunday morning show on WISN TV in Milwaukee. Here's a clip.
We want to make sure that this doesn't become a leverage tool for companies to come to the state and say, we'd like to have the taxpayers pay part of this money, because there's no magic money tree here. We have to go to the taxpayers. So the $116 million or whatever it would end up being, literally we would have to go to taxpayers and say, we're going to take this out of your work check so that we can fund this company. And we're in a very different type of economy than we were 10 years ago. And I think sometimes people have a hard transition. We don't have a jobs issue right now. We have a worker shortage issue. And the net impact on the economy of Kimberly-Clark staying or going will be very minimal, because those workers, although it's unfortunate and you hate to see families go through this.
Good jobs.
There are a lot of jobs out there.
The taxpayers of Wisconsin are not a money tree. You know, money doesn't grow on our trees here.
Yeah, and he's right that we have record unemployment. Is this a time when we need to be subsidizing a business that can't make a go of it? I mean, you kind of start to get this, you start to wonder, 100 years ago, would we want government subsidizing the buggy whip industry so that it can stay in business and keep those jobs? The economy keeps rolling forward.
That's right.
At least with Foxconn, it's sort of a new forward-looking technology.
It's a new sector, and there's an opportunity for growth in that sector. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of opportunity for growth in the paper product sector.
Well, in newspaper business, of course there is.
Yeah.
But why?
Where's our Foxconn-style bailout, Scott?
But right, I mean, people don't use as much paper as they used to, so obviously they're not going to have as many jobs in the paper industry. And then you get automation that does that too. I mean, why are we doing a podcast now? Because newspapers are less in print and they're more digitally. That's where our growth is. You know, Kimberly-Clark needs to do that too.
We need to develop virtual toilet paper or something like that.
This was not even a subsidy that they asked for. It was some politicians saying, after Kimberly-Clark had announced it was closing, saying, hey, let's go do this for them too.
We weren't crazy about the Foxconn deal because it's a ton of money to be giving to one employer. This deal is even worse because it's not even stimulating a new growth in the economy. It's just bailing out a company that's not making it work of its own right now.
Yeah, it seems like it's spending money backwards as opposed to looking forward and spending money.
One thing that I find very worrisome about this whole process is the fact that they're going to call this extraordinary session after the election.
Oh, you don't think that's just a coincidence?
Is that just a coincidence? I was busy in October and November. I couldn't possibly vote on a questionably popular Foxconn-style bailout for my local manufacturer.
Right. I mean, in the Fox Valley, you know, I guess it's easy for us to sit here in Madison and say, hey, tough luck. The economy's changing, Fox Valley. You're going to lose some jobs, but you're also getting a whole bunch of them. But if you're a politician in Fox Valley, that's a tough thing to say.
Yeah.
And it's also a tough vote to take for some people, both for it and against it. And Foxconn is already a big issue in the race for governor and for the legislature. And if you're going to be taking another vote on this and sort of violating the pledge that the governor and Weedick made that this was just a one-time deal, and now you're going to make it a two-time deal and maybe an all-time deal.
Maybe it's a once-a-year deal.
Yeah, that could be embarrassing for some people to vote on.
But what's really disturbing about this being held after the election is that the polling right now doesn't look great for a lot of the people that are sitting in office right now. So Scott Walker's down on the polls. There's a chance, not a good chance, there's a chance that the Democrats could take over the Senate in the fall.
Uh-huh.
So you're going to have a lame duck session. People that have lost their jobs, it's possible that neither Walker will be the sitting governor, and it's possible that the Senate won't be held by Republicans, and they're going to be voting on major legislation after they've lost their jobs. They got nothing to lose at that point.
Yeah. And in fact, they only have things to gain, because what happens with a lot of politicians as they're going out the door is they go to work as lobbyists for special interests. So you also get the potentially corrupting influence of lawmakers who no longer are accountable to the voters in a lame duck session, and maybe they're in negotiation with a special interest group to get a job with them.
To get a cushy lobbying job.
Well, gee, maybe I'll vote for this deal for Kimberly Clark if it helps me grease the skids on this job.
And the special session, it sounds like right now, at least Robin Voss has said that they'll take up anything, not just this Kimberly Clark bill. Any sort of legislation they want to get passed, this could be the time to pass it, which is kind of terrifying that let's just pretend for a second that the people of Wisconsin are fed up and they say, out with you bums. We're getting rid of Scott Walker. We're getting rid of the Senate. The Assembly's not going to turn over because it's just too stacked again. It's too gerrymandered to ever turn to the Democrats.
Yeah, most people think that the Assembly will stay Republican no matter what happens on November 6th.
So these lame duck politicians can pass any sort of thing they want to pass, knowing that they have no political repercussions for doing it. And then if the Assembly stays Republican, it's going to be real hard to overturn anything they've done.
Now, both sides play this game. Back in 2010.
We can't remember that far back, Scott.
I can. Back in 2010, when the Democrats controlled the entire state government, and they lost it all to Walker and the Republicans. A clean sweep. Republicans in the fall of 2010 took control of the legislature and the governor's office, but they weren't going to come into office until early January. Mm-hmm. So the Democrats tried to ram through in sort of the last gasp of the Democratic control, and after the election, they tried to ram through these very expensive contracts for 39,000 state employees. And as you may recall,
nobody does.
Senator Russ Decker, then the Senate Majority Leader for the Democrats, voted against it.
I think it was the deciding vote against it, too, I think.
And the union leader at the time, Marty Beal, never one to sugarcoat his words, called Russ Decker a whore. And
remember the good old days before Donald Trump, and people were respectful each other.
Yeah,
and there was composure and stuff in politics.
Yeah, the Democrats in 2010 really went out with an embarrassing, dysfunctional whimper, and they couldn't get the contract through because Decker refused to vote for it, and some people said that was because he had lost his seat, and he was mad that he hadn't gotten enough support from people.
Especially union people, I would imagine.
And the other Democrat who voted against the union contracts was Jeff Plaley. Well, guess where he wound up?
Where did he wind up?
The Walker administration.
Oh, really?
Yes. They hired him as some kind of administrative official making twice as much money as he ever did as a state senator. So both sides can play this lame duck session game, but that doesn't make it right, especially for voters. And if this was truly extraordinary, they could come in next week and do it. Kimberly Clark, by the way, had set a deadline of the end of September that, look, either you get us some kind of package by then or it's over and this plant's closing.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't meet the deadline, which is why the lawmakers said, well, wait a minute, we're going to call a special session. But gee whiz, guys, we can't do it till after the election.
Gee whiz.
Because we'd be too vulnerable if we did it now.
One more thing about this special session, which is even more sort of, hypocritical, was back when Scott Walker appointed a couple of sitting lawmakers to various administrative posts earlier this year, and tried to not have scheduled elections to replace those seats, basically saying, well, they're not going to be seated until after the session's over, and it's not like we're going to have an extraordinary session this year. So, we don't need to waste the taxpayers' dollars by holding these special elections.
At that time, the governor called these special elections. There was one in Door County for a Senate seat, and there was one in Columbia County, just north of Madison, for an assembly seat. He called these special elections meaningless and a waste of taxpayer money.
Kind of like a bailout to a failing paper company?
They took it to court, and Judge Paul F. Riley of the 2nd District Appellate Court demanded that the elections take place, and the judge said, representative government and the election of our representatives are never, quote, unnecessary, never a waste of taxpayer resources. So the judge really
You mean that very liberal, biased judge?
Actually, the judge is a Republican who grew up in Waukesha County. And now we see why the judge was right and why the governor was wrong, because who won those elections? Well, in the seat in Columbia County, a Republican did win the election to hold that seat, so that doesn't make a difference. But up in Door County,
in the Senate, where the key vote is,
Caleb Frostman, a Democrat, won that seat that had previously been held by a Republican.
And now since they had that election, he'll be sitting for this extraordinary session, right?
That's right. So it wasn't meaningless. In fact, it could cost the governor his package for Kimberly Clark, because there's at least 2 Republicans who have suggested they're against it.
Are there any Democrats in that part of the state where Kimberly Clark is? Are there any Democratic senators in that Fox Valley area? Yeah,
I think there would be some Democrats who might want to support that. In fact, Caleb Frostman's district comes awfully close to Fox Crossing, where the plant is. So I don't know that you could say he's necessarily against it. But still, the special election has changed the makeup of the legislature that would decide it if a lame duck session took this bill up.
It is just hypocritical to talk about how worthless and meaningless the election was, and then to have this pretty key vote coming up for an extraordinary session.
Yeah, generally these lame duck sessions are not good for anything but shenanigans. The bottom line on this is the Foxconn deal, I'm still not sold on that. I think we spent too much taxpayer money to subsidize a company. It smells a lot like corporate welfare to me.
Should we start calling this corporate socialism? Because socialism is a dirty word,
Good point. Corporate socialism.
Corporate socialism.
Now, a worse deal to try to lock in place a business that can't make a run of it up in the Fox Valley, an old school paper company. Now we're extending it to that company.
And kind of setting a precedent that anybody can basically anybody can threaten to
leave the state or shut down, and you can get 17% of your payroll covered. And then where does it stop? It was supposed to stop with Foxconn within a year. They were already offering it to Kimberly Clark. We'll see how the vote goes. And now I guess the one bright spot is to get it through, they're apparently embarrassed enough that they have to use a lame duck session when the politicians are least vulnerable to public opinion.
I just hope that maybe the State Journal can get this Foxconn style deal and they can start paying 70% of our salary.
Yeah. And it would just be added on to our current salary, right?
Just added on, yes, an additional 17%.
Yeah, that works great because everyone knows print newspapers are the future.
We are the future. We are an essential service to the people of Wisconsin.
We do have more readership than ever, Phil. Sometimes that's what people think of when they think of a newspaper as a dying industry, but we actually are a growth industry online.
Yeah.
And our podcast is growing.
Our podcast is absolutely growing by leaps and bounds.
Find and follow our podcast, Center Stage with Milfred and Hands, on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. All of the music on our podcast is by Tube Tester. And thanks to Affio and the Crazy Duck Man for our sound effects.